So this lecture is, well, in this video, we're going to be talking about Marx. We're still working with the inequality reader, so this is going to be the first reading out of that reader. The text takes us through a couple of different essays. And I'm sorry, I'm looking at, I just have my book in front of me, a couple of different essays that Marx wrote about, and they're just sort of excerpts from these different texts. So the first is Classes in Capitalism and Pre-Capitalism. That's sort of the first essay that we're reading. We get a bit from the Communist Manifesto, just a small excerpt from there. Another one from The Poverty of Philosophy and the 18th, no, this is the same one, yeah. Another one from The Poverty of Philosophy. So very small excerpts as Marx is breaking down a couple of the different theories that he works through, that he adds to the contribution of what we understand about capitalism. So we're going to go through just to sort of bracket what Marx is talking about, because these experts do a really good job of explaining sort of like the theories after we understand some of the stuff that I'm going to go through with the slides. So there's some big concepts. If this were an economics class, we'd spend a little bit more time reading sort of like the precursors to Marx. So we'd spend a little time reading like David Ricardo and maybe Adam Smith. I'm sure some of you have heard these names. But we're just focusing on the stratification argument. So we're going to go through the slides. There's some big concepts in the slides. So if you have any questions or if there's a part that's confusing, please let me know and we can talk about it during office hours. The Paradigm of Capitalism. So these slides are essentially going to walk us through the characteristics of capitalism as a system and sort of like what are the basic components. I'll try and outline some of the theories for you, and then I'm going to point out what the Marxian sort of critique or what Marx sort of adds to what we understand about capitalism. So let's start with the commodity. Now this is crucial. This sort of like underpins what the entire theory is sort of based off of. So a commodity is a good or service produced by human labor. So you're probably taking notes right now. You're taking notes with a pencil. That pencil is a commodity. You're probably taking notes on a notebook or a piece of paper. Though that paper, that notebook, that's all a commodity. So a commodity is a good or service produced by human labor. Commodities must have both use value and exchange value. So let's talk about what that means. Use value is our a type of understanding of something being useful for society. So if we think about the pencil or pen in your hand, right, that pencil is useful. If we think about the exchange value, what might you exchange that pencil for? So if I were to say, for this commodity, I will give you another type of commodity, how would you think about exchanging it? So let's say I had a Mercedes-Benz and I was going to exchange my Mercedes-Benz for your pencil. Would you make that deal, right? Would you give me a pencil so that I can give you my Benz, right? If we think about the car versus the pencil, maybe both of them have a different type, but both have use value, right? So this car is useful, especially if you're a commuter and you use your car every day. It's useful to get you places, and you can understand that like the pencil is also useful because, I mean, obviously you're using it. You may not use it as much as you might use your car, so we can think about how to, compare those kinds of use values. But in terms of the exchange value, the car obviously has more exchange value than the pencil, right? Depending on what society you live in, pencils might be more useful than cars and vice versa. But for us in our society, car, if I were to make the opposite true, if I were to say, I'll give you 10,000 pencils for your car, would you make that deal? And that's how we can think about what exchange value and use value, and that's how we understand the values of commodity. Okay, so the value of a commodity represents the amount of human labor. So if we think about a pencil may have, let's say, it might take an hour to make a pencil from start to scratch, whereas it may take a week to make a car. I'm just throwing out numbers here. And so the value of each of these commodities is represented by the amount of human labor. It's a lot quicker to make a pencil than it is to make a car. And so the amount of human labor that is needed to go into that pencil is much different than the value of the amount of human labor that's needed to go into making a car. Value is expressed through price. So this is something that's really important. I'm going to say it again. Value is expressed through price, meaning that value and price are not the same thing. So the amount of value that something might have versus what someone might be willing to pay for it, those two things have a relationship, but they're not the same thing. Value is expressed through price. So the pencil has a lower value than the Mercedes Benz, right? It's lower in value. Now, the price that we're paying for the pencil is an expression of the kind of value that we see this pencil having in sort of like the market, right? Okay, labor power, and I'm going to give you the definition for labor power in just a second, but labor power meaning the amount of labor that is going into this pencil and to that car, right, is the only commodity that reproduces itself. So we are laborers within a society. I mean, some of you out there may be capitalists, but I'm assuming if you're, in school, you're probably not a capitalist. So our labor is used to make commodities, right? This is where we're talking about the amount of human labor. Our human labor, our labor power gets rented out by the capitalist. This is what we do when we go to work, right? We go to work and the capitalist pays us a fee renting out our labor power, right? And so when we talk about different commodities, when you brought that pencil, you weren't expecting that pencil to make more pencils, right? When you go buy your Mercedes Benz, you don't expect that Mercedes Benz to make more Mercedes. But as a commodity, labor power is sort of the only commodity that reproduces itself. It reproduces more commodities. So keep that in mind as we continue to go through. Like, we have a commodity as laborers, and we're renting that out to the capitalists. So let's break two things apart. We've got labor capacity and labor power. If I were going to draw you a diagram of labor capacity and labor power capacity would be this huge circle, right? That's sort of fixed. So if we think about labor capacity is the ability to do work. Think about your household, right? You've got a certain amount of people in your house that are capable of doing certain kinds of work, right? You've also got, I'm assuming, some technology in your house. So you have a refrigerator, you have a dishwasher, you have a stove. All of those technologies also have the ability to do labor, right? Your refrigerator keeps things cold, your dishwasher does dishes, your stove, heats things up for you. You might have a microwave. All of these technologies also have a labor, also participate in our labor capacity of your household, right? And so we could think about, if we were going to think about hours or minutes, how much labor in your household is actually done, right? That would be a huge circle. Labor power, however, is the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities existing in a human being, which is exercised whenever laborers produce use value. Meaning, labor power is some small circle within that labor capacity circle that is the amount of labor that actually gets done. So maybe not everyone in your house, does the actual labor of keeping your house clean. Maybe not everyone in your house does the actual labor of fixing things around the house, or doing some other kind of chore, right? So what amount of labor actually gets done to produce use value? When we're talking about mental and physical capabilities, what we mean is anytime you have to sort of calculate something, if you have to physically pick up and move something, that's all of the labor power, the labor capabilities that exist in a human being, right? And so when we talk about capitalism, when we talk about the market, laborers have labor power. That's what we sell. That's what we sell on the market. We sell our labor power. And what we're trying to do is produce use value. Remember that capitalism is a value production system. Lots of people sort of skip the step. And I'm going to remind you here. I'm going to remind you probably a bunch more times. Value is expressed through price. It's not the same thing. So when we produce use value, it's not to say that we're producing money, right? We're not producing price. We're producing value. Capitalism, the market, is a value production system. So laborers produce use value. Let's say you work at a tire factory, right? Like the amount of tires that you make, that you actually physically sort of construct, right? That's the use value going into our society, because we need tires, and we need people who are producing tires within this current system. Okay, so if we're renting out or selling this commodity, us as laborers, we have labor power, we're renting out our commodity, then how do we talk about the price of that, right? And remember, value is expressed through price. Price and value are not the same thing. So usually when we talk about the price of labor power, we're talking about wages, okay? So the value of labor power depends on market forces. So in other words, it's like any other kind of commodity, right? Where if we have a lot of something, we have a demand for something. If we don't have enough of something, the kind of value that we have for this commodity is going to change based on what the market is doing, right? Okay, hang with me for a second. So the price may be contingently higher or lower than the actual value of that labor power. I'm going to say it again. I know you've heard it a bunch of times now. Value and price are not the same thing. So price could be higher or lower than what the actual value of that labor power is. So when we think about wages, when we think about how much people are getting paid, we can talk about how we don't see a whole lot of fluctuation, right? We don't see a whole lot of people's wages going up, really. We kind of see, if you look at the data in our society, stagnant wages. And this is why Marx argues that he sees wages to be completely outside of the value of labor power. Because if labor power was actually realized, if the value of that labor power was actually realized, wages would have to go up, because that is how you have a commodity exchange, right? We as laborers are producing use value. Our labor power produces commodities, and if we do more of that, the value of our labor power should rise. It does rise. But that also means that the price should also be expressing that value. And so if those two things aren't connected, if the value of the labor power is not connected to the price of the labor power, Marx argues that they are not the same thing. That not only is value of our labor power not expressed through price, that they don't even really have a relationship, which is a problem that Marx points out for the laborer, because if the value of our labor power is never expressed through the price of our labor power, in other words, the wages, then that means that they do not have a relationship. And that it should be with any other commodity, it would sort of ruin the market, right? If any other commodity acted like labor power in terms of the price of it being so independent of the value of it, the market would be ruined. But part of what Marx argues is that so much of the value of our labor power is suppressed due to the actions of the capitalists. So we'll talk in a second about some of the specifics, but the capitalist is constantly trying to suppress the value of labor power, because if the value of the labor power is actually ever realized, the laborers are able to make demands onto the capitalist about their labor, about the kinds of labor they're doing, about the value of their labor, and the capitalist does not want that. The capitalist doesn't want the laborers to make demands. And so the capitalist will do all these things to prevent the laborers from being able to make demands. Okay, so understand that the capitalist is not competing with the laborers, right? The capitalists are not in competition with the people who they employ. There's lots of conflict there, obviously, and for reasons that we'll get into more specifics in a second. There's lots of conflicts there, but they're in competition with each other, right? The capitalist is trying to compete with the other capitalists that are in that same market. So when we talk about value and price and their expression, we go to this concept called socially necessary labor time. Now, I've linked a video for you that goes into more detail about what this is. But the definition is socially necessary labor time regulates the exchange value of the commodities in the market and consequently constrains producers in their attempt to capitalize on labor. So, socially necessary labor time is the process by which we're trying to evaluate the exchange values of commodities on the market. Those consequences is what limits the ability of laborers to actually be able to make demands. And the ways in which capitalists react to socially necessary labor time changing in the market is the root of what Marx would call the type of exploitation that the laborers have to go through. Because as the capitalists are comparing with each other, what the price of some object is, when they come back to the factory, what they do is they make their laborers have to work harder. They either will force laborers to do more work in shorter amount of time. They can invest in technology that regulates the amount of labor that laborers do. They can also hire more laborers in order to make sure that the work gets done faster, right? And all of this is involved in the suppression of the value of your labor power. So we won't even, as laborers, maybe we won't even notice how many more commodities we're making that we're actually not getting paid for. We're not having the realization of the value of our labor power, because again, the capitalist is constantly trying to suppress that value, constantly trying to hide from us how much our labor power is actually worth. Okay, so the whole sort of like spent around capitalism is what we call capital accumulation. So capital accumulation is the surplus value or the capital that the capitalist comes out of the market with, right? So there's some kind of surplus value that the capitalist has. So I like to explain it like this. When think about the old school telephones, right? the landline. Some of you maybe have never even seen one, but back in the day, there used to be these things called landlines, and those landline phones could essentially last you your whole lifetime. I mean, unless you like drop the damn thing on the floor and it shattered in a billion pieces. I mean, I think I still have somewhere, and I'm sure my mom still has her old landline phone, and if I plugged that thing into the wall today, it would still work, right? Um, and so maybe you need to buy one or two of those over your lifetime, right? The use value for a landline phone. I mean, we needed them, and so we pay a lot of money for them, which is what we would exchange for those phones. But we really wouldn't need to get them more than once or twice in our lifetimes. Well, think about how many cell phones you've had over the course of your life. Usually, when I'm in person classes, students will tell me that, I mean, the average so far, just a rough average is more than four. Some people have had way more than four, but the average is about more than four cell phones over your lifetime, right? And what are the usage of your phone, right? You might access the internet. You may, you take a call. Obviously, if some people still take calls these days, so you might need to take a call, text someone, send an email, right? In other words, accessing the internet, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, all these apps that we can use give us the idea that these cell phones are increasing in terms of their use value. But when we actually look at the data of what people are using their phones for, it hasn't increased over the past 10 years. We're still sort of using them for the same sort of functions. And so when we talk about the kind of value that, let's say Apple, I'm going to pick on Apple for a second. Apple might be reproducing for its company. That value is being added. And because we are adding to the value of Apple, we're also adding to the type of surplus value that they get when they come out of the market. And then they produce a new phone, and I don't have Apple phone, so I don't actually know what the number is, but whatever. They come out with a 10.9 and then they get the 11 or whatever. Clearly, I don't know what I'm talking about. But that new phone, the difference between them is slight, right? They might maybe increase the function on the camera. They might increase the function on, I don't know, the speed of the internet that you're allowed to have, even though that's a whole farce. But the point is that their surplus value gets added not because we are willing to buy the phone, but because the laborers themselves are producing more phones at a particular time. So go back to that video on socially necessary labor time. So the process of capital accumulation forms the basis of capitalism. It is what the capitalist is trying to do in the market. The capitalist is trying to get more surplus value than what they went into the market with. Now, they might go into the market with a particular amount of surplus value, and then let's say they come in with $1 million, and then they come out with 2.5 million, right? Then they do it again. They come in with 2.5 million, they come out with 7 million, then they do it again. Go into the market with 7 million, then they come out with 10 million, whatever. At any point, they could get out of the market, right? At any point, they could be like, all right, well, now I got $10 million. This is good. I did a good thing. But what's happening is the capitalists are staying in the market, right? And as Marx is writing the text that we're reading, what he's noticing is that not only are capitalists staying in the market for really long times, there's also fewer and fewer people who are allowed to even invest in markets in that way. And those few people that are searching for this capital accumulation are exploiting more and more workers. And we'll get into that in a second. Okay, so the rate of accumulation is 1, the value of the net increase in the stock of capital in a period. I'm going to remind us again. Value is expressed through price. So this is not to say that we're talking about the rate of increase in money that they're getting or the rate of increase in wealth that capitalists are getting, but it's the value. It's how much value are they able to increase in a particular period. 2, the proportion of realized surplus value or profit income, which is reinvested rather than consumed. So as I was talking about, if the capitalist was like, all right, I made $10 million, I'm going to get out of the market. I'm going to go do something else. I'm going to go live on my yacht for 10 years. This would not be a part of what we talk about of the rate of accumulation, right? We also have to consider how much of it gets realized and how much of it gets reinvested. So this leads us to two different kinds of value that the capitalist will invest in, or the capitalist will take out of the market. So the first is surplus value. So surplus value is the profits, the gains that the capitalist makes from the market. So when the capitalist is gaining all of this value, right? Either we're talking about use value that they can then invest in exchange value, the capitalist is taking that out of the market, right? That's what they end up with at the end of the market. And so the only way to get surplus value is to exploit your laborers, right? Exploit the people that you're working for, and I'll explain how in a second. And to help, and by doing that, you force them to make, or you are part of the production of them making more commodities, right? And if you are able to get them to make more commodities through that exploitation, what's supposed to happen is we're all supposed to win, right? The value of the product goes up, the value of the capitalist that the capitalist makes goes up. And so what should go up with that is the value of the labor power, because the laborers are making more commodities. Their value is also more useful. So they should be able to exchange that commodity, exchange that labor power for more money. But as I said, the capitalist is constantly doing things to try and suppress the value of labor power. One of the ways that they do that is what's called relative surplus value. So this is a situation of increasing production gains. Some of those gains go to the workers in terms of the increased standard of living, right? So instead of investing in wages, which the capitalist is supposed to do in order to exchange your commodity fairly, what the capitalist will instead do is increase your standard of living. So this could be things like giving you more benefits, investing in higher taxes, investing in more vacation time. They could build a gym in the factory, or maybe they help out with living costs in some way, right? And for the capitalists, they will say that this is what is a response to the increase in the value of labor power, but it's actually hiding the value of our labor power by not fully realizing what that value is. So this is inconsistent with the rate of exploitation, right? So how much surplus value, whether or not people invest in relative surplus value, is still not enough to account for the kind of exploitation that we see when we look at what the laborers are actually doing. Okay, so this is the common argument that the capitalist will argue. And you've probably heard this before. If the capitalist pays more wages, they lose out in terms of the money that they get from coming out of the market, right? If they pay you more in wages, they lose out in terms of the money. So for the capitalist, it's a very connected chart, right? If Marx were to redraw that chart, so let's say the green is the amount of wages that we have, and the orange line is the rate of accumulation, right? For the capitalist, it's a very connected system. But as Marx is arguing, they're actually not connected at all. And this is because of what we're going to talk about in a second, because of the concept of the working day. So let's look at, this is sort of like a checkpoint summary slide. Let's look at how the capitalists views the market. So let's go through each step one by one. So we're going to start up at the top. we have some kind of accumulation of surplus value. This is capital, right? That capital gets reinvested. So the capitalist takes that surplus value and then reinvests it. A portion of that surplus value gets capitalized. This generates the market, which calls for an increased demand for labor power. So here's where we can talk about use value and exchange value. When the market gets generated, there's an increased demand for labor power, meaning there's more use value. This is the increase of use value of the commodity of labor power, which is increasing the value of labor power. That leads to absorption, which we call absorption of the surplus population, right? So when we think about that circle that we went back to, labor capacity versus labor power. Labor capacity, right, was that big fixed circle, and inside there's a smaller circle of labor power. So here we're seeing that labor power has to expand, right? Because we're going to absorb some of that surplus population that's still inside of our labor capacity bubble. So when we're talking about absorbing the surplus population, what we're saying is that also the exchange value of labor power is going to increase, because as there's an increased demand for labor power, and as there is an absorption of the surplus population, that's exchange value and use value increasing. So what should happen, because we as laborers start to produce more, right? We're making more commodity, we're reproducing more value. Wages should have to rise, right? Wages should be rising because that is the value being expressed through price. But according to the capitalist, or what the capitalist will argue, is that if I increase wages, I will then get less surplus value. And if I get less surplus value, I have less accumulation of capital, which means I have less surplus value to reinvest into the market, and all of this whole cycle gets messed up. So instead of increasing wages, what the capitalists will then do is invest in relative surplus value. And by investing in relative surplus value, I decrease the risk that laborers will realize the actual value of their labor power, meaning that the laborers won't be able to make demands. The laborers won't be able to make demands about wages because they don't understand the connection of their value of their labor power and what the connection is to that price. Okay, so a lot of this boils down to the working day. So when we're talking about what a work day is, I'm going to use the 8-hour system because that's sort of the system that we are more accustomed to nowadays. So I'm going to break that down, but I want you to understand that the working day is a relatively new concept. Think about it. If it were up to the capitalist would work the laborer night and day. The capitalist would not stop working the capitalist would not stop the laborer from using their labor power to produce the more commodities, right? Because the more commodities that the laborer produces, the more surplus value that the capitalist is going to get out of the market. So if it were up to the capitalist, the laborer will work day and night. But you can't do that, right? You cannot work someone 24 hours a day. There has to be some break time. So much of this 8-hour work system is actually a result of labor movements, right? Or people demanding that they have breaks and that they only have a certain amount of hours that they're actually working. Okay, So let's say that your workday is from A to C. That's the entire workday. Now I'm going to use the Starbucks example. I don't know why, but this is what always lands with my students. So every time I give this example, I have other examples. So if you need another example, I can give you one. So let's talk about a Starbucks barista, right? Let's say that the Starbucks barista, let's just give an even number. Let's say $12. The Starbucks barista makes $12 an hour for 8 hours. So that's 12 times 8, which is 96. So let's round that up to 100. So let's say the Starbucks employee makes $100 a day. In other words, Starbucks is paying that barista to make them $100 worth of coffee. If we think about how long it takes a Starbucks employee to make $100 worth of coffee, if we're very generous on a slow day, I mean, really we're talking about 30 minutes, but let's just say it takes them an hour to sell $100 worth of coffee. Every minute that they work after that is free labor. When we talk about commodities, right? If I'm saying, I want you to make me a pot and I will give you 3 bowls, right? You make me a pot, I give you 3 bowls. If we just exchange those commodities, there's no such thing as surplus, right? I give you my 3 bowls, you give me my pot, we exchange, it's an even exchange. But the problem is capitalism is based off of accumulation, meaning that it's based on surplus. There has to be some kind of surplus. And so all of capitalism is completely built off of this idea that somebody has to be working for free. There has to be free labor somewhere. So going back to this chart, we have A to B and then B to C. So A to B is labor power that actually gets rented. So this is the amount of labor power that the capitalist is actually paying for. B to C is the free labor for the capitalist, right? That's that everything after that first hour of selling that $100 worth of coffee, that's all of that free labor. So this is the conflict that Marx is pointing out from the laborer and the capitalist. The laborer wants A to be as long as possible. They want A to B to fill up as much of their working days as it can. But the capitalist wants B to C to be as long as possible. They want as much free labor as they can because free labor equals more surplus value. So the capitalist and the laborer, as Marx points out, will always be at odds because of this dynamic right here. The problem is, as Marx points out, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about this, this sort of system right here is not what Marx is arguing. This is just how capitalism works. There's no other way that capitalism can work. What Marx says, though, is that one day the laborer will realize this, right? This is what Marx is talking about when he's talking about this sort of like consciousness that the laborers have to get. Once they get a consciousness around the capitalist is screwing them over, that they're making B and C to be entirely too long, right? In that barista example, if the barista sells $100 worth of coffee in an hour, they're working for free for 7 hours. And so what the laborers, according to Marx, need is what's called class consciousness. We all have to realize that our working day is being divided from paid labor and free labor. And once we realize that, this will help us overthrow the capitalist system. So this example here is not a Marxian argument. That's just how capitalism works. But what Marx is arguing is that one day we're going to realize this, and this is what's going to help shut all of capitalism down. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with this quote. This is on page 33 of your reader. It comes out of the Communist Manifesto. Marx says, an oppressed class is the vital condition for every society founded on the antagonisms of classes. The emancipation of the oppressed class thus implies necessarily the creation of a new society. For the oppressed class to be able to emancipate itself, it is necessary that the productive powers already acquired and the existing social relations should no longer be capable of existing side by side. Of all the instruments of production, the greatest productive power is the revolutionary class itself. The organization of revolutionary elements as a class supposes the existence of all the productive forces which could be engendered in the bosoms of the old society. Okay, this is where Marx is sort of seen as this sort of visionary, right? You've probably heard in the Communist Manifesto, he's sort of like pitching for this revolution where the workers, the laborers, the proletariat are free themselves from this capitalist system, right? They are the oppressed class that necessitate these sort of this sort of conflict, right? And so for Marx, the way out is through revolution, right? He sort of talks in this section that I just read for you, this passage, he's talking about we have to completely change all of society. The only way to undo this is to change all of society and create a new sort of society, a new economic system for which society can exist on. So when we're thinking about, the types of stratifications that exist around class, that exist around economics and the economy, for Marx and for many other sociologists, the object isn't to invent or reimagine a fairer or different kind of capitalism, a fairer or different kind of economic system that may exist within the same types of antagonisms, but still produce the same kinds of inequality. For Marx, he's saying that the only way sort of out of the system is to have a revolution. So we can think about, is Marx, is he naive? Is he naive to prescribe this kind of solution for society? Is Marx, Marx is writing this in sort of the beginning sort of tale of the Industrial Revolution. The kind of capitalism system that we have now is much more different. We'll read about this later on down the line in class, but we're talking about a completely different global economy that's only increased in the kinds of exploitations that Marx is talking about. So we can think about how perhaps there needs to be a new prescription. Perhaps the kinds of anatomy that we're talking about as the problems of capitalism, maybe some of them still exist, but how many of them have been added on to, how many of them have been reconstructed. And so this is sort of the position that Marx sort of sits in within the conversations around capitalism. Many of his concepts still hold true. Many of his concepts still sort of have these sort of really reliable. They were really reliable in terms of their conversations around what would happen if we allowed capitalism to get as big as it is now. But what is the way to sort of like disconnect our society from the way capitalism has sort of like entrenched itself within it, within the way in which we think of what a viable society has to be. Sometimes I'll ask my students, think about how the world ends, right? Why would the world end, right? So, I mean, now we might think of like virus, right? There's just a virus and it just completely kills off all the life forces like that exist on Earth. We might think of a comet, right? A comet comes and bust a hole in Earth and, there goes Earth. We might think of aliens, right? Aliens come, take over the planet and, ruin all the ability to grow plant or grow food here, right? And so there's all these ways in which we can imagine like the world ending. But when I ask my students, okay, so how can you think about capitalism ending? Like what way does capitalism end? Now, obviously the world has existed long before capitalism, but we can't even imagine what a society might look like outside or after capitalism. And so this is why when Marx was talking about the only solution is revolution, is because, the constant sort of like rechanging of capitalism that has positioned us to really tie in this level of inequality, this level of stratification within a society based on this man-made idea of how to run an economic system is what's sort of holding us back from moving forward to something that looks more fair, something that looks that has more equality built within it. Okay, I know that was a lot. That was a mouthful. As I said in the beginning of the video, if you are struggling with some of these concepts, that's okay. This is a really sort of tough stuff to wrap your head around. So be sure to email me if you have any questions. Let me know if you need, in your email, let me know if you need something sort of like restated or if you need something to be a little bit more explained. And as always, we can always talk about your questions during office hours. All right, so stay safe. I'm sorry if you can hear Megan Thee Stallion in the background. Somebody's playing, one of my neighbors is playing Megan Thee Stallion. So stay safe and take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.